This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 825 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. One of the most frequent questions that I got this week surrounded selling Bijan Robinson, trading him away. One person even told me that they were aggressively trying to trade him away after his 3-yard performance in Week 7. Now, by now, we know why Robinson only had 3 yards this past week. We didn't know it before the game started, but he was dealing with a headache. And as someone who suffered with migraines for parts of my life, I totally feel that. No one should be bashing Robinson for feeling ill. That's silly. I'm just not sure why this would be the week that you'd want to trade away Bijan Robinson. I've been trying to think about the logic behind this. And I think the only reason you might want to bail right now is because Arthur Smith openly just doesn't care about having a bell cow back. He doesn't not want a bell cow back, but he's clearly not going to force the issue. But didn't we already know that? Given what we saw from Week 1 through Week 6? The reason Robinson is so attractive in fantasy, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but it's because he's still a productive fantasy asset that has plenty of room for growth on the volume front. Like, you could look at someone like Josh Jacobs, who's a regression candidate to be clear, but someone like Jacobs, his upside has to come from that regression hitting, which is very possible. This is not an anti-Josh Jacobs take. It's just an example. But Jacobs is basically maxed out on the volume front. He's not going to see more volume in his offense. That's nearly impossible for him to do. Robinson was averaging 15.8 PPR points per game prior to Week 7. On the season, only 10 running backs have averaged more points per contest. And that was on just a 52% running back rush share per game rate, meaning he was barely seeing over half of his team's running back rushes, and he was still averaging 15.8 PPR points per game. Compared to the other players on that top 10 list, Robinson's backfield share was by far the lowest. In other words, there's upside. There's potential for the Falcons to give him more work, and that gives him a legit top 3 running back ceiling. All that changed from that stance to where we are today is that he had a headache and he didn't play. Now, maybe Arthur Smith's attitude is turning you off, but I don't anticipate Robinson's workload to get worse compared to what it was between weeks 1 through 6. Unless the headache thing is chronic. But it doesn't sound like that's the case. Now, I wanted to kick off the show with that because I got a lot of questions surrounding Robinson. I'm still relatively high on him rest of season, despite the way that the Falcons are divvying up that workload. Like, I get it. Trust me, I get it. Last week was beyond frustrating. Arthur Smith's comments since then, also frustrating. But assuming Robinson's healthy, that frustration really doesn't have anything to do with what's going to happen from now through the end of the fantasy season. It's all done. We can't assume that we're going to have a situation like that happen again. So I'd hold on to Robinson right now, not trade him away. Now, before getting into the other mailbag questions this week, I'm just going to send another reminder to check out the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. You get weekly rankings and tiers, rest of season rankings and tiers, live stream Q&As, data dumps, and more. Head to lateround.com to learn more. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Daniel. It says, how do we value Devonta Smith, Tee Higgins, and Jaylen Waddle rest of season? I drafted them at what I felt was a discount, but my worst fears came true. These three seem like they're in similar situations being talented, but not getting wide receiver 1 looks/volume. Do we still hold? Flip them for an RB2 like Madison or Ramondre? So I also got a lot of questions about these guys this week, so let's discuss it. First off, a very quick and easy way to see if players are over or underperforming versus expectation is by looking at expected fantasy points. I personally don't have an expected points formula of my own, but other spots do, like Pro Football Focus. PFF's expected points model shows that Devonta Smith is the wide receiver 26 in overall expected points at wide receiver, and he's underperformed versus that expectation. Jaylen Waddle's wide receiver 27. We know that he's been banged up at times this year. And then Tee Higgins, who's also been unhealthy, he's at wide receiver 45. So none of those guys have gotten the kind of looks to generate a top 15 season at the position right now. A year ago, Devonta Smith was around the wide receiver 17 range. He's gone from averaging 13.2 expected points per game to 12.2. That's driven by a lot of factors. But one obvious one is that his target share per game rate last year was 27%, and now it's 22%. Like straight up, he's not seeing as much volume. Now, part of that is A.J. Brown going through this stretch of dominance. But I also credit this to the fact that they're throwing to their running backs more. Philly's running back target share is now a little above average. Last year, it ranked 32nd in the league. There's a 7% difference in running back target share year over year for Philadelphia. So those targets are going to running backs and not somewhere else in the offense. Now, I do think the gap between A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith from a target share perspective, that's going to shrink a little bit from here on out. Right now, the difference in target share per game between A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith is 11.3%. Last season, it was about 2%. Brown's just running hot right now. And Smith does have some regression coming just naturally. He also has some value to his profile in fantasy because if A.J. Brown gets hurt, Devonta Smith gets a big boost. So expect Smith to be better, but that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. Now, Jaylen Waddle on an expected points per game basis is closer to wide receiver 20, and he's performed over a point per game below that expectation. I would consider him more of a regression candidate than even Devonta Smith. The problem, though, is something I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show earlier this week. Miami's passing schedule, not great from now through the end of the year. So he's probably more of a buy than a sell, Jaylen Waddle is, but I still think that there are environmental things that we have to worry about a little bit. And then with Tee Higgins, I think Higgins has just vastly underperformed to start the year. And so have the Bengals. They started to pick it up a little bit of late, but Tee Higgins was banged up when the Bengals offense started to look better. So he underperformed partially due to environment, and then he was hurt. He didn't play his regular snaps the last time we saw this Bengals offense. Higgins is someone who's played well below his points per game expectation according to PFF's model. We're talking 5 to 6 points per game. Just given that, and given who he is as a player, I think he's an obvious buy candidate. So each player is playing below expectation right now. And for one reason or another, there's some belief that they should all be better moving forward. This next question is also from Patreon. It's from Jesse. It says, how do you think the Carolina Panthers will handle the running back committee when Miles Sanders is back? Yeah, so I talked about Chuba Hubbard a couple of weeks ago on the 15 Transaction Show, noting that he's basically been better than Miles Sanders within any rushing metric that you can find. And that's still true. Hubbard has been the better player this year. And now you have a new play caller for Carolina. And you also have Frank Reich saying the following this week. This is courtesy of the Charlotte Observer. Reich said, Chuba's looked good. Obviously, we love Miles, and Miles has continued to make good progress. It's always going to be a little bit by committee. That's typically our approach. So the actual mix, that could vary week to week. So we'll see how things play out this week. Now, I don't think taking a quote from a coach and running with it is the right way to analyze fantasy football. That's honestly what got a lot of Miles Sanders drafters in trouble in the first place. What I do think is important is giving everything proper context. The fact that Hubbard has been objectively better, and maybe you disagree, but it's kind of hard to disagree. But the fact that Hubbard has been better than Sanders this season, and then this quote comes out, I think that's telling. It's not like Frank Reich came out and said, Miles is our guy, when Chuba's been outperforming him. He makes note that Chuba's looked good, because he has looked good. And then he talks about a committee. So I am expecting a committee moving forward. But for multiple weeks now, I've had Hubbard ranked ahead of Miles Sanders in my rest of season rankings. Because I think that he's been the better player. And things have been trending in his direction. This next question is from Dan. It says, what do we do with Christian Watson in Dynasty? Is he a hold or a sell given Jordan Love's recent play? Look, my stance on Watson has been that he was a volatile Dynasty asset, but he was a good redraft target. And that often seems backwards to a lot of people. Why would a young player be a better target in redraft than in Dynasty? But it all comes down to investment. In redraft, if you spend a 4th or a 5th round pick on Watson, it's not going to sink your team. You can still be okay. You can still win a championship. You can be fine. In Dynasty, if you're dishing out multiple firsts for Christian Watson before the season, then you're putting a lot more eggs in that basket. And he's always been a very volatile player. In the late round prospect guide over the offseason, in the year 2 model section where I talk about second-year players and I profile them, I wrote the following. I said, quote, "So in essence, we're close to where we were last offseason. Christian Watson is a high-ceiling pass catcher who comes with a big reward." And I said that within the context that his 3 comps entering year 2 were DK Metcalf, which is a good one, and then Greg Little and Chase Claypool. Now, I'm prefacing with all of this because I don't think anything's really changed aside from the fact that he's trended towards his floor rather than his ceiling. He hasn't shown up yet. But like I said in the 15 transaction show, I think he's still a buy and redraft. I won't say what I said on Tuesday, but you can hit pause if you haven't listened to that, and you can go listen to that 15 transactions episode. Now, as for Dynasty, I'm not ready to take on Christian Watson unless I can get a price under market. But if I have him, this is not the time to sell. Jordan Love can still be okay enough for him this year. And Love isn't a lock to be Watson's quarterback long term. So Watson's a buy and redraft because the market hates him in that format. He's a hold in Dynasty because he continues to be a very volatile asset. It really comes down to your own risk tolerance. The last question this week is from @JacobDeal_film. It says, at what point do touchdowns go from a stat we cling to versus one we regress? CEH was a huge sell last year because of his touchdowns early in the season. Yet Jordan Addison has had unreal touchdown success this season, and we're all aboard the Addison train. Not saying I don't buy into him, just seems like everyone's overlooking the seemingly unsustainable touchdown luck. So let's first look at Addison himself here. On the season, he has 6 touchdowns on 44 targets, which is pretty absurd. But according to that same PFF expected points model that I talked about earlier, Addison has outperformed touchdown expectation by 1.9 touchdowns this year. He's lower than Tyreek Hill, DJ Moore, and Courtland Sutton. So he's definitely a regression candidate, but he's not the biggest regression candidate in the league. But he is a regression candidate. I wanted to get that out there. We're all on the same page now. But I think the disconnect here is talent evaluation and career trajectory. Clyde Edwards-Helaire was a huge regression candidate to start last season. He was a bigger one than what we're seeing with Addison right now. But then on top of that, and this is very, very important, we had no reason to truly believe that Clyde Edwards-Helaire was going to be a very good player at his position. We had 2 years of evidence that he was not that great. Meanwhile, Jordan Addison has played 7 career NFL games, and he's already doing what he's doing. And I would also argue that I don't think the fantasy industry has been super irrational with Jordan Addison, at least from what I've seen. I think some are naturally going to argue that he's not ranked as something like a mid-range wide receiver 2 when he should be. But most takes on Addison, they seem pretty reasonable. That he probably won't keep up this touchdown pace, but what he's shown in the NFL so far, what he's shown is very, very promising. And when you have that promise, when you flash this early in your career, that's usually a very good sign for future production. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I got a Late Round Perspectives episode hitting later today. Hope you listen to that. Hope you enjoy it, and I hope you enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.